Well, welcome everyone to SIG Multicluster's Tuesday, July 9th meetup. It looks like we have a few items on the agenda today. I don't see Ryan here.
He pinged me. He told me to go ahead before him.
So
we have a very related topic, him
perfect. And Corentin, why don't you kick us off?
Awesome. Let me find my screen first. Where is it? Here. Boop. All right. Is that sharing? Let me know if you see it.
Yes.
Awesome. So to give some context before I start showing the slides, Ryan and I have been thinking about like credentials and how a controller would interact with a multi-cluster controller would interact with cluster profiles. How will they use it? And what we realize is that some of the problems or some of the things a controller asks the user to configure are the RBAC in the clusters and the credentials. What I'm going to focus on is the RBAC in the workload clusters. How can you set that up more easily? And I think I want to make some proposals there and see if the SIG is interested and if I should keep going that path. And I think Ryan is focusing a little bit more on the credentials and where the result of some of what we're talking about would go. So let me introduce first like what we're trying to do here. If you take the example of Argo CD, for example, it's got a controller in a management cluster, so a central cluster. That's where the cluster profile would be. So for Argo, this is currently under some secrets, and they put some credentials in there, and that configures how they can reach out the clusters and know the list of clusters. And then Argo's got an equivalent, like a dedicated RBAC binding in there in each cluster. So when they talk to the workload cluster, they can actually do their job. So that's like the fairly like standard. We see the same thing with Q, but the credentials here looks a little, not the credentials, but like the configuration always looks a little bit different. And that's what we're trying to optimize for cluster profiles. So this is kind of like making it more generic. We introduced cluster inventory and cluster profiles, so the cluster profile would be somewhere in there. And you're going to hear me say feature a lot. I put in the initial slide, there are multi-cluster controllers or features or third-party application. I don't want to have an opinion on the name, but in GK Fleet, we call them features. So my brain, is very stuck on that name. So I keep coming back to that. But anyway, so we have features or multi-cluster controllers that want to use cluster profiles. So what will they need? They'll need some credentials, and they'll need RBAC to be set up in the workload clusters. So I'm going to focus on the RBAC because selfishly, I think we can use workload identity for the creds, and that'll simplify things when you're using one of the major cloud. I think we have solutions to also help later, but I want to figure out the RBAC problem. So we want to set up RBAC in each workload cluster. When the clusters come and go, we want to add the RBAC. We want to remove the RBAC. So we must know the principle that the controller will use, because when we do an RBAC role binding, what are we actually binding? Is it a user, a group? Is it something local? Like, can the management cluster have credentials that are accessible by the workload cluster, things like that? We want it to be automatically set up so that whenever you add a cluster profile, like whenever a cluster manager adds a cluster profile, that automatically gets configured. And we want to find a way so that features can be installed or removed by an administrator on the management cluster. We want to make that process a little formal, I think. So what I would like to suggest, I think here is to enable this feature controller, we would introduce a new type of a new CRD, which would be a feature CRD. And I'll show more in details what it look like. And we would have a controller, or I mean, we don't have to introduce a controller, but at least there would be a controller wherever that lives. that would leverage those CRDs or those CRs and configure the RBAC in the cluster. So this would be the only piece that has RBAC management in the workload cluster. So when you create a workload cluster, there's only one RBAC you'd have to set up at creation time. And then the rest of it, you can actually manage it directly in the management cluster via that CR. So what that gives you is only one cluster admin, ideally, and each feature controller would be limited to the RBAC. So you can install, remove features in that management cluster kind of as you wish. And also when you keep on adding cluster profile, well, they automatically get configured when they get added, removed. So this is kind of what I like to propose, like as a feature API. So it would be a multi-cluster controller. A feature would represent a multi-cluster controller that wants to leverage cluster profiles. And so it would set up what RBAC, what permission they need in the workload clusters. I think we could also have some step ultimately for credential setup, or we will anyway need to say which credential it will use, or if it needs to generate some. I think that's an important part. This is the cluster manager's admin, so it's the admin that needs to set up the features. So here, if I go back, this object is blue. It's the person that's installing the whole thing that needs to create this. Like Argo itself doesn't control its own definition in some way. That's because you don't want Argo to be able to escalate its own, whatever it puts in there. So it's like the configuration. That's why it's slightly separate. And it's kind of repeat, but in order to enable that block, we would want the RBAC to be in there, and we wouldn't want to define what credential it uses or would want to use. And what it looked like, I think, is very raw as a spec. I'm starting with like a simple, like the credentials part, I'm using like existing principle. If I was to use workload identity, like that helps simplify for that particular use case here. So I would say, oh, this is going to be a user with this service account. Ignore the thing, just assume it's a string. And the important part would be, okay, what RBAC do I need in the cluster? So it could look something like that, like, okay, here are the rules, that this Argo CD will need. It needs, like, in this case, pod, full access to pods, I guess. And then there would be a feature authorizer controller, again, GKE mindset, because that's something we do a little similarly. It would watch the cluster profile CRs and watch the feature CRs and write RBAC in the remote clusters thanks to those two. And so it'll reconcile for each pair of cluster profile and feature. So it sets up RBAC in there. And then the question after that is, where do we put the state of this actuation to say, okay, we actually did it and you're good to go, and give a signal to the feature? And that's fair. I think Ryan has been looking more into, and it'll show his doc, and I think he's going more into that. It's like for each pair of cluster profile and feature, we'll want that state to go somewhere. And there could be some more information, like the endpoint, and just telling, like, okay, you're good to go, just giving that signal. So I think he explores it in his doc, so I'll put a link there, but he'll present it after if he's here. And yeah, so it's like, where would we put that state? Is like, do we need an extra CRD for the state that mixes cluster and feature as one, or should that go in the feature CRD as a state, or should that go in the cluster profile as a state? So that's also some of the options we're looking to talk about. That's it. I went quite fast about it. And I'm looking for comments on this. What do you think about it? Is it worth exploring? Like, are we on the same page that this is a problem worth solving? I would start with that first question. And then, is the solution Like, would it align with what you would think about? Jack, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you for this. So, to be clear, the cluster profile resources that are being populated inside this cluster inventory are happening by some other actor. So
Correct.
this feature simply consumes the set as it grows and contracts over time.
That's the intent, yes.
Are we talking about, so I see, great, that makes sense with the reads arrows there. So the feature is consuming the data inside the cluster inventory to get access to, or to get exposure to what workload clusters are in the fleet. How is that? How are those writes set up? How are we writing those RBAC? Are we just not worrying about that in this particular design in terms of getting access to the workload clusters to do those RBAC writes?
In my mind,
Out of scope for this?
It would have to be this controller here, the feature manager controller's configuration, right? So I'm not sure we can avoid whoever creates those cluster to delegate permission and know about this feature manager's cluster admin effectively in the workload cluster. The main, I think, thing that we gain though is at least you only have one to configure, and you give one of them. That's the idea. Is like,
yeah, the concern I have there would be like adding a feature to an existing fleet of clusters. So if we have cluster inventory as a general purpose way to expose fleets of clusters to
right.
a general set of multi-cluster bits of foo, call them features or whatever. If I inject a new feature into an existing management cluster scenario like this,
right.
Which knows about an existing set of workload clusters that were created by some infra provisioner that had no idea of this new feature that arrives, how does that feature get access to the workload clusters without? It seems like the credentials would have to be somewhere in the cluster inventory itself. So a feature can land on a management cluster and it can then consume credentials
so if you were
to workload clusters that it didn't know about.
If you were to create another feature here, let's say you like put that block, whoop, you get a new one, right? And you get feature 2. You would have to create a new CR here. Oh, come on, there you go. So you'd create a new CR, right? And as a result, you'd get new RBAC. This one would create it, right? Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Like that logically makes sense. I just wonder where the credentials to make that new RBAC on that workload cluster 1, how do those credentials present themselves to that custom resource?
This controller here has its own credentials. Okay, maybe I can show that. So if this controller has, let's say, admin creds, and there should be a RBAC that's set up, RBAC for admin creds. So that should be set up like when the cluster is created. That should be the like admin step, if you will.
Like there's a lot of hands up, so I should let other folks.
I think I'll continue this questioning though. So this means that we basically require that now there's admin credentials in that management cluster for all the other clusters, which is scary.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, definitely. But it's so you get it is scary, but it gives you the ability to kind of install and remove those features as you wish. That's what you get. But
so part of this, this was why I originally raised my hand, but I think it's a good continuation. Part of this starts to feel a lot like, back in KubeFed type territory, which I think is, expected because we want to be able to build this kind of deployment stuff, but it feels like it's not. So providing the RBAC doesn't help without also having the workload deployed as well. Like why do we need to standardize this RBAC deployment mechanism separate from, like, we're going to put stuff in the cluster. Should we be, do we need to standardize this at this level, or can you use whatever you're using to roll out config to clusters?
I think if I understand what you're asking, we could have the feature CR here, but we could potentially move this, like, okay, that's going to be ugly, but move it here. Maybe the cluster could reach out and figure out if it's acceptable to it. But I think something like that, we could keep the CRD, like the intent as like, okay, I want this feature type of thing. And maybe the controller lives somewhere else, is like either it lives on each workload cluster and they figure out centrally where the features would be, or maybe it's even like a third-party thing that is running not on the management cluster, but outside of it.
Yeah, yes, I think these to me seem more interesting as opportunities, because like, and I know we've got other topics to talk about credentials, but I've been pretty against the idea of standardizing like centralized access as well, because I think like in general, it's fine if you have to do it in a certain circumstance, but as a practice, you don't want a situation where there's a cluster that, when compromised, gives you access to all your other clusters. So if we could avoid putting admin credentials and admin permissions centralized, that would be great. The idea of having config centralized that then gets reconciled, I think makes a lot of sense as a concept, as long as it doesn't have to come with this global access. And again, like maybe that's okay in a certain implementation, but as a standard, I don't think we'd want to encourage it.
I'll take that as an action item to have some proposals of different solutions. I think I can keep somewhat of the same API, like as the CRD definition. I could keep some of the same and have proposals on where the controller would live, like the actuator would live, and maybe that solves that, or finding a new way to like have the pattern slightly different, maybe multiple controllers each for each cluster. Like I'll look into something like that. I think though the API might be able to stay stable, and I could keep that definition and figure out where the actuator is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of questions will be answered with the presentation on the credential. This is actually a complement to that doc. Yeah, by that time, I think we could answer a lot of those questions, especially like why we need to standardize this feature API. And the credential part, I think, is more about implementation details. We won't have those in the spec. It's for implementations.
Ryan, you had your hand up. Did you have another topic you want to talk about, or?
No, I think Li Chen hand is before me.
Oh, sorry.
So my question I have is that it seems that whenever you create a feature CR, that means the feature will exist in every cluster. Is that the model we have in mind, or is it possible that some member clusters may not have the same features as others?
I think here a feature could have a cluster selector and say which of the cluster of the inventory it wants to be on. I've been talking about it with other folks that have asked this question when I reviewed. I think a cluster selector works well here, and we would have labels on the cluster inventory, and you filter like that. That's definitely a nuance I would put there, and I think it's the feature that would decide where it wants to go. I mean, well, it would be configured, and like the blue block here would have something like a cluster selector. I didn't put it in there, but I was thinking of it. I originally had it and I removed it for thing, but you could have a cluster selector here. Like, I don't know, region, US East, something like that. That would be the idea. You declare intent there.
Are there any other questions? maybe I can present the second half, then we can discuss more, because that will kind of complete the story. Probably can answer a lot of questions regarding this too.
All right, you got the floor. Stop sharing.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon. Let me see if I can present. Where's the present? Oh, share. Do I have permission? Oh, I need to set up my system permission. Maybe I need to, sorry, I need to restart.
Hold on, I can share it for you if you want. Here you go. Can anyone see it?
Yep, but it looks like.
Yep. I think your presenter is in a reconcile loop. He'll be.
Yeah. There we go.
You muted, Ryan. Otherwise, your doc is on the screen.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. So this is kind of continue our discussion on the credentials. And the main goal currently we're trying to integrate with, so the original, very origin reason for us to propose this cluster profile API is to integrate with third parties, because we have Argo CD and other multi-cluster aware applications that want to integrate with multiple cluster management systems without integrating with each other on their own proprietary APIs. So this is kind of trying to fulfill that promise. And there are some use cases here. Currently, we are focusing on two cases. One is Q, one is Argo CD. For the Q itself has a multi-queue system. It does support multi-queue or multi-cluster queue. But if you click into, you don't have to click now, but if you look at their setups, it's it's actually super long and very tedious to set up just only one single cluster. And they don't have any way to easily add a cluster, remove a cluster. But those are the things that all the cluster management system have already, all the projects like OCM, Kamada, ClusterNet, and Fleets have done these. Those are all building like basic functionality in all the cluster management systems. But Q would like to be able to just tap into those capacities without them reinvent the wheel. And Argo CD has the same story. Argo CD currently also have some multi-cluster features, but it's relatively preliminary. And the way they now access a cluster is basically store their credentials into a secret. And that's exactly what Jeremy said is not the best practice. So now they have a hub cluster and everybody's credential basically is a secret on that cluster. So that's how they do it now. And they don't have actually don't have a CRD to define that. It's just a secret, have some format there. So now, okay, scroll down. Here's where this talk and this part is related to Corentin's part. So ideally, this is kind of the flow. The flow is the third party. I call it third party in Corentin's presentation. Basically, that's a feature. So Argo CD is a feature, Q is a feature you think of. So for a feature, first they need to register the application with the multi-cluster manager. The registration part is pretty much what the Corentin's feature API is. Basically the third party needs to tell the multi-cluster manager, say, hey, please allow me to work with the cluster inventory that you are managing. That's basically the idea. Because otherwise, if you want anyone want to do any automatically, the cluster managers have no idea what to do for them. So in that API, exactly what Corentin just mentioned, you need to tell the cluster manager what type of so basically auth and authentication and authorization, right? So first authentication, they have to tell the multi-cluster manager how can I be authenticated, either through some cert or in the most cloud providers, you have some identity service. Then you just give them your service credential or some token, and then it would work. And then the next part is need to set up the authorization, which is in Kubernetes world is basically RBAC. In some cloud provider, I think you can even set it on a cloud provider too. So you need to tell the multi-cluster manager, say, I need those type of RBACs. If you, for those who are interested, you can click into the Queues link. You can see Queue has a huge amount of RBACs set up for one cluster. And that's only for one cluster, right? So if you need to repeat it for like 20 times, it's not going to be fun. So this API, this flow is basically what kind of the top part of the flow is basically kind of what Corentin's presentation is about. So some automatic way to set up that, register with cluster manager, then cluster manager knows, oh, this is my cluster inventory. I will set up these credentials for you, set up the authentication authorization for you. And then this doc is mostly about the second part, actually, because the first part is the automatic part. The thing is, even without automatic part, it still works if we make the cloud, we get the credential information back into the cluster profile APIs, right? That would still work. So here's the API proposal. It's very straightforward. It's just a name plus object reference, which is currently we are going to reference a secret. This looks simple for credential, but there are many different. It's kind of at least three orthogonal options between where, how, or what to put into the cluster profile API. So the credential wouldn't change, or most likely it's very flexible, right? You can see it's access ref, so you pretty much can access anything into the cluster. But the question has, as I mentioned, there are 3 dimensions. The first dimension is, I think Corentin's presentation also alluded to, is at the end, in essence, it is the credential and RBAC is per cluster per application, right? You wanna, when I call application, you can, it's application or feature per cluster per feature. We want to unify the terminology, right? So for example, you want to Argo CD on cluster A, you want this RBAC, and then you want to say Q on cluster B and Q on cluster A, things like that, right? So that's the nature of it. However, there are at least two ways to organize that. Here, of course, you could also create another third CRD to store those information. But for now, we want to focus back on this because the cluster profile was created mostly for that purpose. So the option A is just like the real, the kind of distributed way. So it's a one cluster profile per cluster per application. So that means for the case of, for example, if we have a cluster inventory of 3 clusters and the 2 features, that will be 6 cluster profiles, just to be make it clear. The pros is it's relatively conceptually clean, right? Because it is essentially the credentials will be per cluster per feature. So, and we have one object that contains that. The obvious downside is you duplicate this cluster profile. If you have many features, you multiply the cluster profile. The cluster profile was kind of initially designed to be one-on-one with the cluster. So that's definitely the downside. Here's an example of that setup. If I don't know who is sharing, someone who is sharing can scroll down a little bit. Yeah, so you can see that basically we will have 2 cluster profile, each with a ref. One is for Q, one is for Argo CD. And the thing is, you can see that they each are in their own namespace. So they don't have overlap namespace. And that makes the RBAC setup for each feature a lot easier, right? So you say the Argo CD would have all their work cluster profiles in their namespace, and the secret is also in their namespace. So Argo CD have their own namespace with all the cluster profiles. With the original example, 3 clusters, 2 features, right? So we will have 2 namespaces. One namespace has 3 cluster profiles, work class 1, 2, 3 for Argo, and one namespace has 3 cluster profiles for Q. So that's how it's set up. So the RBAC is easy. Single one looks relatively clean. But another downside is for one feature, it's likely they may have multiple credentials. For example, even for that Argo CD feature, there's one is more powerful admin type of credential, so that the RBAC is different from other ones. So this one also probably need, it's already a list. Yeah, so it's already a list. So the credentials already needs to be a list anyway. So this is the one setup. The second setup is we still keep one cluster profile for all the clusters. Then we would have to cram in all the features into one cluster profile. So in that case, you can see the namespace is in a fleet system. So basically, there's a system namespace. The profile is, so there's only one namespace holding a cluster infantry. For example, Mike has a question. Does this namespace usage? It may not be a cluster set though. This one may or may not be a cluster set, and I think about the cluster set part later. Thanks, Mike, for the question. For this one, then each cluster infantry is in their own namespace. Right, so the fleet system or whatever the cluster infantry name is, it's in their own namespace. And then inside that, every time there's a new feature comes in, we add a credential onto that.
So that's the second option, right? The first option we would have, it would be basically a separate cluster inventory per feature, right?
Per feature, yeah.
That seems like that would be a pretty huge change in what we're trying to accomplish with the cluster inventory.
Exactly. That's why the preference, if you scroll down a little bit, the current preference is option B, because it's as I said, it's per getting to multiple, for single cluster have multiple representation is kind of what, yeah, very different from what our initial thought was. So that the preference is option B. I'm just presenting those kind of options, and we do have a preference. And then the second dimension of is we had a huge discussion last time, and we're coming back to this again, status versus spec. The cloud profile API in some sense is kind of similar to the service import. It is sort of so-called a status object itself, because it's not a cluster API, right? That's exactly the difference. We are not a cluster API. That the spec is not supposed to drive a lot of things. The exception is this credential part. So the spec versus status again, right? For the pros, if you put into status, it's at least in my mind, it's mostly natural that the status shows it's what it has instead of what it should be. It's what it has. So the credentials are created by another controller, and the controller that Corentin is. It could be a controller, could be something else, but it's created by it's set up by some other third parties and then put into this status as reflect what it has. The problem with that is without that automatic flow, if you look at my flow graph, without the top part that we don't have yet, right? The Corentin's presentation, it is kind of awkward for someone to set up directly into some object status, like you have to patch the status in the beginning. For any manual setup, it's a little bit, not a little bit weird. I think that's not convention. You put into the spec. So that's the drawback of the spec.
I want to ask the same question actually we asked in the MCS conversation. Should there even be a spec? Like we tend to think spec or status, but if we're debating about where it should go, because neither makes sense, like, is this a resource that actually has a spec, or is this like, if there's spec and status are basically request response, right? Mm-hmm. Intent and result of reconciliation.
Exactly.
If there's no if customers are not provisioning or requesting changes as part of this spec, and it just is a representation of a cluster, should there be a spec?
Actually, can you scroll down to the spec part, for the credential? Actually, it is exactly what I'm going to talk about. So the pros and cons for the spec part, right? So the credential information in the spec part is exactly this. So that enable user to do the manual setup. So if without the automatic part, if we don't have that yet, it allows user to put that into spec. Basically, that's a request. And then we would have a response in the status. So going back to the preference, just let me finish. The preference is actually having both. So whatever is in the spec is the request. It's optional. You don't have to have a request. The request could actually, ideally, the request should go to the current flow, the upper part of the flow, going to register. That is supposed to be the request. But again, that part, as we know, it's still just starting. So here I would like to add this optional spec so that even without that flow, or that flow is not working for some certain reasons, we will still have this request. Then the status is the response, and the response is the truth. So with the spec and status, the feature is always going to read from the status, because just like service IP, you can give me a wrong IP. I would in the status is I'm supposed to, or in the status the controller actually can block it. So if you ask me for register for admin credential, and for some reason we think you should not have admin credential, then in the status you will get something else or just nothing. That's a high level. We didn't flesh out the details. So the preference is actually have optional spec and ask the controllers to write that into the status. That's the current time. I have a question.
Yeah, I think there are two options that are not in the doc that could be viable too. Is either if we have a feature API/CRD, those credentials, those like configuration, that signal per cluster per feature could go in the feature CRD. I think that's one of the option, and in that case, it makes it, I think, pretty clear that it would be a state. It's like a status, because the spec is like, oh, I declare my feature, and the status would be, hey, here are a bunch of credentials for the clusters that exist. The other option that is not there, which I allude to, I think, is having yet another CRD. I know it's quite a bit, but at least that would be clear that this per cluster per feature object. And then for that one, that could go in the spec, because that would be like, here is the per cluster per feature object, and I think that's the spec of it. And then the feature could consume it and write a status when whatever they want there, I guess. So for that one, that would be a spec, I think, because the consumer would be different. It would be written. So I think those are the two extra options that make it. And I think that's what, for cluster profile, same thing. I think it goes in the state. It's like the spec is whatever the cluster is, and the state is what the resulting stuff from locally is. So that's my perspective on spec state. But I think there's two extra options that we should write down.
Yeah, I can write them down. But personally, I think the feature is, I think I alluded to in a private conversation, is if the feature objects supposedly to be relatively stable, but the clusters can come and go, so that ideally you register one feature, and then when the new cluster joins the cluster inventory, and automatically there will be a cluster profile showing up. But then the feature itself, if it has the credential, then it have to have a combination of cluster. The feature API would have a lot of stuff in there, and the integration point becomes not, the cluster profile is designed to be the single integration point for every feature or third applications. But anyway, I will write that down. Definitely good. Good suggestion. And Arthur, I think your hand is the next.
Yeah, but I might go second actually, because it was more a comment about first presentation. But so maybe Jack, you want to go first to bounce back on?
Okay, sure. Ryan, can you talk about manual setup in that statement under the preference. The spec field is optional, which is mostly there to facilitate manuals. Can you walk us through that in the graph above, in the diagram above? Because
if it's a
I don't know
manual,
where manual setup fits in. What does that mean?
if it's manual, then basically you don't have the whole the first part, the register application. There's none of those register part, right? And then the user have to automatically the user, basically the user is admin for each member cluster, for each spoke cluster, workload cluster, whatever you call them. And then they have to automatically, actually the best part illustration is, let me finish, then you can go back, is then you have to have admin credential log into that member cluster, get the kubectl, basically get the kubeconfig, and then get that kubeconfig, and then also apply all the RBACs you want, the thing that Corentin shows that are all the rows, cluster rows, apply that to that member cluster, spoke cluster, then come back and set the spec, say this is my kubectl or kubeconfig with the basically the certs there, put it into a secret, and then point that, manually fill out that field. If I don't know who is sharing the screen. If you scroll down a little bit, see the look at the here the access ref, right? The access ref will be a secret. So you place that secret into a namespace and then set up this manually set up this access ref pointing to that secret. That's the flow. And if you want to know exactly the flow, that's the queue, the link. I have that. If you look at that queue link, that's exactly the current manual way to, this multi-queue one. You can see how it's set up one by one. So the reason we want to have this automatic one is in order for us to convince queue to integrate with us. Their current situation is if we have this manual setup, then we are pretty much equivalent to what they are doing. That's pretty much one-on-one. If we have the automatic one, then we can save them tons of energy setup script. The whole setup becomes very simple. If we don't have the automatic flow that Corentin was describing, it's still achievable, but it's like a one-to-one mapping to what they are doing now. It's just they need to change a little bit of their CRDs, but we can achieve exactly what they can do. But without our cluster profile or the credential API, then we cannot do anything. That's why I would like to get this API at least settled. So manually can be done. We have the equivalent on par with what they have. And then if we have the automatic one, then it will be a huge incentive for them. I think you can see the comments from the queue's maintainer, forget his name. So they were curious of what integration with this cluster profile whole system, what brings them, what's the value. Not Jen is the Argo CD's maintainer. Is his name? Aldo.
So I think that you've done a great job of explaining. It just strikes me that we're maybe trying to have our cake and eat it too, and having a sort of overloaded architecture by supporting both the manual and automatic. So I would go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. The main reason is the automatic part is we haven't started the we kind of have a very preliminary design like Corentin described. It may take a while for us to get there, but we kind of want to not block this part. So on-par part could go first, and then we can have but that's just my personal.
I guess the long tail seems very undesirable. Like, once we get this architecture fully baked in the happy path, you're describing the automatic path as sort of the happy path. It becomes confusing, I think, forever after for users. Why is there a spec status overload? So like I feel like I don't know what the bar is, but I would want to meet a pretty high bar for imposing that level of ambiguity into the API design itself. And I'm not sure that I understand that's being met. But thanks for explaining. Let's let other folks.
I agree. Arthur, are you ready?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's more a comment like about the automatic like airbag ending. I'm not sure if it makes a lot of sense for Argo CD because you have to set up an admin cred for this new controller, right? But for instance, I operate like a multi-cluster Argo CD, and I already have this airbag for Argo CD, and I can also set up other airbag with that. So I'm not sure if it's super appealing to people that are have already this Argo CD multi-cluster setup, because usually Argo CD is already admin on all cluster and they can do whatever they want with Argo CD. And Argo CD also has some internal airbag stuff with project in Argo CD. So, but for Q, I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Just to see if I understand. So Argos, are you saying the Argos, there's less incentive for Argo CD to integrate with cluster profile or whatever our API? Is that what?
Yeah, a bit, because the new automatic controller need admin airbag, and I already have admin airbag from our Argo CD.
No. Just to clarify, that is the implementation details. For example, I think most of the, I think actually all of the cluster managers, the manager don't have cluster admin credential there. We all have this pool model basically. So if you want to put the roles onto those member clusters, the members, as Quarantine showed, one option is the member is going to pull from the hub cluster instead of hub cluster push it there. So hub cluster has no credential, any credential on the member cluster actually. So
I think when the, sorry, let me try to take a stab also. I think I was saying, I think one understands the separation of concern, I think, is what we could gain here. Today, when you set up your workload clusters, you have to know that you want Argo CD on them, and set up the Argo CD, you have to know where Argo CD and all that. It's equivalent to that. I'm replacing this with just the indirection of that feature manager effectively. Instead of Argo CD, and then the feature manager gives it to Argo CD. So it's true that if you already have it for Argo CD, that wouldn't change anything. It's just changing the indirection. If you have multiple features, though, that's I think where it starts making sense, because you could say, oh, if you configure that one thing and you configure always that one thing, and then you could have Argo CD, Q, and potentially other things. I think that's where it starts making sense.
Actually, even with Argo CD, with the automatic flow, definitely make things a lot easier, because you don't have to manually, whenever you create a new cluster into your cluster inventory or remove a cluster out of cluster inventory, those are going to be taken care of by the cloud manager automatically. Currently, now you need to set, as I said, manually, you need to create another, you need to put all the RBACs into that cluster, set up secret, point it there. None of them need to be done anymore. All these manual steps are handled by.
But in the automatic way, you still have to set up something so that the new controller does stuff.
The new controller, the only thing you need to say is the register API or feature, whatever that Quarantine's API called. That API, you set it once. Every new cluster comes into the cloud inventory would automatically have what you want it to be.
That's right. I think he's right, though. There's still that blue controller that I have in the slides. That thing still needs, wherever that thing lives, that thing still needs access to the workload cluster.
It can do that. So this is basically part of in the grand scheme of things. This will be part of the cluster manager per se, like this big controller. This has
not necessarily. I think with the isolation
conceptually, yeah, it could be a separate controller, but conceptually, this is the cloud cluster manager thing that manage the inventory. Conceptually, controller can be, it can be separate conceptually. So this one can do the pool model. Means you don't have to set up this blue thing on the cluster and the main RBAC for and the main credential and anymore. Everything will be automatic. At least implementation wise, we know all the implementation all the cluster manager projects have this automatically done. That's one of the reasons Argo CD want to integrate with us. We all have this automatically taken care of, so they don't have to do anything. But again, that's the kind of implementation detail.
Yeah, I think, Arthur, this is a thing I'll take as the AI that I had for Jeremy too. It's like, what are the options we have if we have that feature API? Where could we set the controllers, and in what case does it make your life easier and more secure? Potentially, either one of them, I guess you'd have to pick. yeah, and I think that's what you'd potentially get is like if you're using kind of that fleet thing that has cluster admin already, then you don't have to install Argo CD and you could rely on that thing. But there's so many ways that can be set up. I think that'll depend on that.
Just as a point of example, in our setup, for instance, we rely on EKS and we create, we set up AWS IAM basically, and we just allow the service account of Argo CD, of our central Argo CD, and then we just set up the secret with the URL and stuff. So, and usually also Argo CD is just system master because we just configure everything with Argo CD, so it needs to be admin. So yeah, I don't know if it would, as a user, it would make my life easier with that because I also don't have any other multi-cluster controller. But I think if I would have Q, for instance, it could make a lot of sense with Argo CD, like both of them. Well, anyway, yeah, that's interesting topic, but just wanted to have this clear. Maybe just a phrasing issue as well, how you sell it to user. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks. I think who's next? I think maybe
Me.
Pichen
One, I think.
or the.
Yeah, I think I'm probably the next one. So, I think after Arthur presented his views, I think it seems to me that we should provide both options. One option is allow customer to use feature CR to actually deploy the role bindings. The other one is allow customer to directly like tell cluster profile that which credential should be used. That means the credential should be in spec. My other, that's my comment. Then I also have a question, which is the doc, Ryan, your doc did not talk about how consumers are going to consume those credentials. I assume that all the consumers like Argo CD or Q actually will basically consume the status from cluster profile to achieve credentials.
Yeah, consume. I think I mentioned that.
Okay.
Yeah, they always read from status.
Yeah, that means that like when if in some use cases people put the credentials into spec, we will also generate credentials in the status, right? After verifying they exist basically.
Exactly. I think I mentioned that if they can put in the spec, we will basically vet it. They cannot just put in anything. We will have something. It's an implementation detail, but the controller has the sole discretionary to honor what they ask. If we honor it, then put it into the status. If not, depends on, we can define them like semantics, make it null or do something different. Yeah, but status is the truth. Spec is what they want. Yeah.
Yeah, basically all the consumer will consume the status of cluster profile to retrieve credentials.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
One time.
Hi. Hello, Rain.
Hello.
Nice
Hello.
to meet you here. I have a question about the option B, right? The idea is put multiple
Option B on the first one, the first dimension, the one per is this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
The idea is put multiple credential in one cluster profile, right? And the cluster profile will be shared by maybe more than one applications, right?
Yeah. But look at
what I'm thinking is there might be a security concerning that,
look at the secret. The secret is in different namespace. If you look at the example, so we put the class profile.
Oh, I got it. So one application can know there are several credentials there, but it cannot access it, right?
Yeah. So you see this namespace, the Q's namespace is in Q systems. The Argo CD secret is in Argo systems. So the secret is in their namespace. The cluster profile is still in the main cluster inventory namespace.
Right. Thank you. That makes sense.
That does feel kind of weird to me. Like if we could have a situation where there's like dozens of credentials listed in different namespaces, but as a controller, I need to know which one I'm concerned with, and then something doesn't feel quite right. I think we should think about what other options we might have.
That's actually a
question.
API has two. I'll link the SIG. What is it? Rob Scott has a pending proposal about to address this.
Okay, awesome. So I think we definitely want more discussion here on the doc. I think there's some good takeaways, some updates to make. In the last 2 minutes, Jack, sorry to cut you so short on time.
I just wanted to quickly, I see that Stephen isn't here, so I've been bugging him offline for reviews on the end-to-end PRs that John H has up. So I think everything's fine. It's not like the end-to-end tests are keeping the MCS graduation behind, but just a call out for if anyone feels qualified to review those, that'd be great. And if we want to sort of lay out any additional end-to-end tasks, we'll continue to pick those up.
Sounds good. Yeah, I can take a pass at that. Steven's actually on vacation right now.
Good for him. We should all be go on vacation if you're in the
Happy
northern.
All right. Okay. Well, then I think we are at the end. Is there anything else for today? Or we can definitely have some offline follow-up, and imagine we'll continue this discussion in a couple weeks.
Just one question. When is the KubeCon maintenance track CF?
Yeah, we have a little over a week on that. So Ryan, I know you expressed some interest.
Yeah, that's
being part of that. That'd be great. You can follow up with folks offline.
Okay.
And if anybody's interested in being part of that, please ping me on Slack. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.